And that cortical plate, then cells can continue dividing and reorganizing so that we have the 6-layered cortex. We had covered up to there. And like if I'm not clear, please, the class rep, just interrupt and let me know. And if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat. I hope you are all getting me. Class rep?
Yes. Yes, we are getting.
Fine, thank you. Now, during the development of the neural tube, we said the most caudal part of the neural tube develops to form the spinal cord. The cranial part forms the 3 primary brain vesicles, and the caudal part forms the spinal cord. The caudomost part of the spinal cord, that is in the area of the sacral area and the coccygeal area, these parts do not form from the ectoderm, they instead form from the mesoderm. In the process, we refer to as the secondary neurulation. Secondary neurulation. So the mesodermal cells organize to form a solid core of cells, and this solid core of cells attach to the most caudal part of ectoderm, that was the neural tube. This solid core of cells then canalize to form a tube that is continuous with the neural tube. And because of this, these areas are normally prone to most of the congenital malformations. That's where we have the spina bifida, like we had talked about earlier. So I'd like us today to look at the spinal cord, and if we have time, look at the brainstem. The spinal cord, like I've said, comprises of the caudal part of this neural tube, develops from the caudal part of the neural tube, and comprises of an alar plate and a basal plate, just like what we had seen before. We also have a roof plate and a floor plate. If you remember, we had talked about roof plate, floor plate. And again, if you remember, we talked about the neural tube being at the level of L2 in the case of the adults, extending from the foramen magnum, that is at the area where it joins the medulla oblongata, up to L2 in the case of the adult. In the case of a newborn, it would be possibly at the level of L4. So the rest of the neural tube would be comprising of because of the differential growth of the vertebral column and the neural tube, the vertebral column grows faster than the neural tube. However, the spinal nerves still emerge in the corresponding areas of the vertebral column. So from the level of L2, that's what we call conus medullaris of the spinal cord. The rest will comprise of the spinal nerves, just spinal nerves alone, and these spinal nerves aggregate to form what you call cauda equina. The spinal cord ends at L2, but the spinal nerves still emerge from their corresponding vertebral column. So we have what is referred to as cauda equina, which is a cluster of spinal nerves. The spinal cord is still attached. The conus medullaris of the spinal cord is attached to the coccyx by what we refer to as filum terminale, which is a tough fibrous connective tissue. Tough fibrous connective tissue film that extends from the conus medullaris to the coccyx. The spinal cord is covered by meninges. We'll be looking at the coverings of the brain and the spinal cord later on. It's covered by meninges, both the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And if you remember, again, we have on the dorsal part of the spinal cord, we have a median sulcus, a depression, and posterolateral sulcus. Two posterolateral sulcus on either side and a median sulcus. These posterolateral sulcus are associated with the blood vessels. On the ventral side, we have a fissure which extends all the way to the floor plate. And on the dorsal side, we have of the spinal cord, we have a septum. On the ventral side of the fissure, this is associated with the anterior spinal artery, and the anterior spinal artery is formed by vertebral arteries. The two vertebral arteries give a blood vessel that joins to form the anterior spinal arteries. On the lateral side of the spinal cord, we have the rootlets of the spinal nerves. Each spinal nerve comprises of rootlets. This is comprised of the dorsal rootlets, which carry sensory information from the spinal ganglia, and the ventral rootlets, which carry motor information. So the dorsal is sensory, the ventral rootlets carry motor. It's joined together to form a dorsal root of the spinal nerve and a ventral root of the spinal nerve, carrying both sensory and motor fibers respectively. Remember also that the dorsal root is the one which forms the dorsal rootlets. The dorsal rootlets. On the other hand, from the basal plate, which is now the ventral horn or the anterior horn, we have the processes that leave the anterior horn as motor fibers, supply the skeletal muscles, and also carrying fibers that supply the autonomic fibers. So this is a global view of the spinal cord. And in this global view, we see this butterfly-shaped structure that is the gray matter. The gray matter. And this gray matter was formed by the mantle zone of the neural tube. So the gray matter comprised of the basal part, the basal plate, and the dorsal part comprising of the sensory ala part. So the dorsal is sensory from ala, and the ventral is from the basal plate, so it's motor. So this is motor, and this is sensory. Motor and sensory. Now, in between that, we have the two sides, right and left. We remember we had a roof plate and a floor plate. So this is a fissure extending from the median sulcus. This is a fissure, on the anterior part, and this is a septum extending from the median sulcus. And we have the anterior spinal artery in this position. The rest is the white matter, and this white matter has been stained to show myelination. So we have a myelin sheath surrounding the spinal nerves, surrounding the neurons, and this myelin sheath is formed in the case of the spinal cord by the oligodendrocytes. The oligodendrocytes. This part, which connects the two parts of the spinal cord, both right and left, is what we refer to as the commissure. So we have the gray commissure and the white commissure. Gray commissure and white commissure. So for the gray matter, we have a dorsal horn and a ventral horn. The dorsal horn and ventral horn at this position here in some areas of the spinal cord, that is from That is the area from T1 to L2. From T1 to L2, we have a lateral horn. That lateral horn corresponds to the autonomic nervous system, is the output for the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. So this part here would be the intermediolateral part, and this will be containing cell bodies for the autonomic nervous system. For the white part, or the white matter is divided into the dorsal part, the dorsal column, and this dorsal column is divided into two. We have this very close to the medial part here, that is fasciculus gracilis, and this other part will be fasciculus cuneatus. When you talk about fasciculus, it's a fascicle. A fascicle contains bundle of axons. And then we have the lateral fasciculus, the lateral part here, and we have the anterior part. So we have the dorsal, the lateral, and the anterior part of the white matter. And remember, the anterior part is separated by a fissure. The dorsal part is separated by a septum. The gross anatomy will tell you about the blood supply. I think we had discussed about that. And the gray matter, I've talked about the anterior part. We have the lateral column. We have the posterior column. Posterior column is the same as the dorsal column. Posterior is the same as the dorsal. And the rest is, I will be talking about as we look at the spinal cord. So this is dorsal, this is ventral. So anterior is also referred to as ventral, and the posterior is referred to as the dorsal. For the neurons, we can classify neurons in several ways. We have what we call radicular neurons. These leave the spinal cord and form, for example, the output from the ventral horn. So we refer to those as radicular neurons. These are mainly the motor neurons and also autonomic neurons. Motor neurons from the basal part or the ventral horn, and also autonomic from the lateral horn and intermediolateral. Then we have endogenous neurons. These do not leave the spinal cord. The endogenous neurons act as interneurons. They connect different parts of the spinal cord. They connect, for example, the dorsal horn and the ventral horn, acting as interneurons. They also are association neurons, intercalated neurons, and commission neurons that cross the midline. Those we refer to as part of the endogenous type of neurons. The intercalated neurons specifically are in the area of substantia gelatinosa, which is in the dorsal horn. The Renshaw are interneurons, specialized type of interneurons, connecting the dorsal horn and the ventral horn specifically for the synapses of the corticospinal tract. Part of the spinocerebellar tract have their neurons originating from the dorsal part and therefore form part of the endogenous neurons. For the gray matter comprises of aggregates of cell bodies. These aggregates of cell bodies, we refer to them as the nuclei. So there are several types of nuclei. Nucleus dorsomarginalis, depending on where it is. This carries propriospinal fibers from the joints, sensory information from the joints, substantia gelatinosa. This one's from dendritic trees, and this is mainly connecting in the area of the dorsal horn. Nucleus proprius. Nucleus proprius, this is source for the spinothalamic tract, spinoreticular tract, and also from interneurons on the spinal reflexes. We have nucleus dorsalis. These are from the spinocerebella, ipsilateral for spinocerebella, and also act as afferents for the muscle spindle apparatus. The muscle spindle apparatus are very important in regulation of muscle tone. Nucleus intermediolaterales, these are for interneurons. Interneurons from the regions, these refer to the regions, what we refer to as the regions within the gray matter. We have regions within the gray matter where the nuclei are located, and those regions carry specific information, both excitatory and inhibitory. So this is just an example of what we have. On the dorsal column, we have fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. And then we have the lateral column of white matter and the ventral column, or also called anterior column. When you look at the gray matter, you will note that the gray matter, we have nuclear aggregates of cell bodies, and this just represents regions, Rexen's regions, where we have Rexen 1, Rexen 2, all the way Rexen 9. And these regions, you can notice that the cell bodies controlling the foot, the leg, the hip is very close to the midline. The foot is very much away from the midline. So you can generally say that the cell bodies controlling the body at the trunk will be very close to the midline, and the more peripheral will be away from the midline. So damage to this area, for example, will lead to paralysis in the foot region, in the hip region. Damage to this area will lead to paralysis in the foot region. These are what we call Rex type of lamina. For the motor nuclei, we normally have somatotopic representation. When I say somatotopic representation, the bundles of nuclei in the specific region carry neurons from a specific part of the body. Specific part of the body. The white matter, those also carry specific information, both ascending and descending fibers from specific areas of the cortex, and also carry ascending information from specific. So the white matter represent both descending fibers from the higher centers of the brain to the spinal cord. We have the ascending tracts from the spinal cord taking information to the higher centers of the brain. And also, we have a very special area that we refer to as fasciculus proprius, and fasciculus proprius is the region bordering the white matter and the gray matter. So this is the region comprising of white matter bordering the gray matter. And these ones are interconnecting different parts of the spinal cord, connecting different parts of the spinal cord. So this is an example of a cross-section of the spinal cord. In this cross-section, I've said the white matter carries ascending and descending tracts. And from the descending tracts, it will end up with spinal. For example, here we have lateral corticospinal, and the lateral corticospinal carries information from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Cerebral cortex from the spinal cord. This is carrying information that is motor. And these ones from these areas here, they'll synapse with the ventral horn nuclei. And then from the ventral horn, we then have axons leaving to supply through the ventral horn. We have axons that form the tracts that carry information to the muscles. We have olivospinal from the olivary nucleus, again controlling movement. We have vestibulospinal from the vestibular apparatus within the ear to the spinal cord, and this is very important in controlling, again, muscle tone and also movement. Corticospinal tract. Remember, we have lateral corticospinal comprising of crossed fibers, and anterior corticospinal, again from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, carrying uncrossed fibers. So these are descending type of fiber tracts. And then from we have the spinothalamic from the spinal cord to the thalamus. So we have an anterior spinothalamic and a lateral spinothalamic. Again, anterior and lateral based on their location. We are also going to see that each of these ascending and descending. For example, anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar. These ones here are carrying information from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Then special is the dorsal column. In the dorsal column, we have fasciculus gracilis, very close to the median area, and fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. This again is carrying sensory information, special type of sensory information. We'll be looking at what they represent. So in a nutshell, we are saying that the white matter of the spinal cord comprised of both ascending and descending tracts. A tract is a group of axons, a bundle of axons that carry specific information. And then we have the fasciculus proprius, and I've said fasciculus proprius is not carrying any specific ascending or descending information, but is connecting the different parts of the spinal cord. This is just to illustrate what we are talking about. Take, for example, the corticospinal tract. Corticospinal tract is from the cerebral cortex. We have a lateral corticospinal tract and anterior corticospinal tract. So this lateral corticospinal tract from the cerebral cortex, the axons then leave synapse and synapse with the either interneurons, some synapse with the interneurons, or synapse directly with the cell bodies within the ventral horn of the spinal cord, the motor horn of the spinal cord. And then from the motor horn of the spinal cord, we now have motor neurons that now we refer to as the lower motor neurons that supply the muscles. Lower motor neurons supplying the muscles. Notice that all this from the corticospinal tract, from the rubrospinal tract, is from the red nucleus, from the reticulospinal tract. All these are synapsing with the motor neurons in the ventral horn. And from this ventral horn, we then have efferent fibers output from the ventral horn as motor neurons to supply the muscles. Supply the muscles. Again, notice that we have interneurons that connect this, and this can be inhibitory or excitatory. Interneurons can be inhibitory or excitatory. We have vestibulospinal tract and also reticulospinal tract. So for the vestibulospinal tract from the ear, the middle ear, to be able to control muscles and muscle tone, it must synapse the cell bodies within the ventral horn. So this is what I mean by descending fiber tracts regulating motor output. For the sensory pathways, we have the dorsal column, also called posterior column, and this also continues on as a lemniscal system. The first order neurons is from the skin, and in the dorsal column, this is divided into two parts. We have the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. So the first order neurons are in the spinal cord, in the dorsal column. These synapse are the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus in the medulla oblongata. After that, we have a second order neuron. This second order neuron now form what we call the medial lemniscus. At this area of the medulla oblongata, the second order neurons cross over from the right to the left and the left to the right. Those from the right cross over to the left, and those from the left cross over to the right. This is what we refer to as sensory decussation. These second order neurons then extend up to the thalamus. So from the thalamus, we have a third order neuron. So the medial lemniscus axons then synapse with the third order neuron from the thalamus, which extend to the somatosensory cortex of the brain, and also association cortex. What is unique about this dorsal column? The axons have a larger diameter compared to the others, They are very heavily myelinated. Because of being heavily myelinated and also large diameter, they can transmit the information very fast. So they are fast transmitting axons. There are very few synapses. Just look at this. The first synapse is at the medulla. The second synapse is at the thalamus. So there are very few synapses. That's why we say oligosynaptic. They also represent specific parts of the body. They represent specific parts of the body. So that's why we say it is somatotopic. What type of sensation do they carry? They carry touch, which require very high sensitization, localization. So they're very specific in terms of touch, specific in terms of pressure, specific in terms of vibration, anything vibrating on the movement of the skin. There is what we call discriminative pressure. So you are able to detect different modalities in terms of their sensitivity. Discriminative touch, it's not just crude touch. To be able to discriminate various touch. 2-point discrimination. Stereognosis. If you touch something, you are able to recognize it just by touching because you are able to feel the contours of that touch. Position sense. Any vibration, any movement. Say a flea is passing is on your skin. You can be able to detect that. Awareness of shape, awareness of size, awareness of texture. You are able to discriminate that. So this is what we call epicritical sensation. Epicritical sensation. So the dorsal column carries epicritical sensation. That is touch and deep sensibility. The receptors responsible for this are the Meckel's receptors on the skin, the Meissner's receptors, the Pacinian corpuscles, peritracheal receptors around the hair follicles, the Ruffini, the muscle spindle receptors. So these are responsible for this deep sensibility, or what you call epicritical sensation. For example, if there is no skin deformation, think of a flea walking on your skin. It will not deform anything much. So that will normally be by the anterior spinothalamic tract. If there is deformation, if there's no deformation, that is, if there's deformation, then that is where you are using Pacinian corpuscle. For example, you are touching something with a lot of pressure. What does this dorsal column have? We have fasciculus gracilis, and fasciculus gracilis carries information from below T6. From below T6. All the information is carried feel something from your toe, and they are able to discriminate. Then that is being carried fingers in your hand, you are able to feel and say this is cotton or this is silk, then that is fasciculus cuneatus. Then that is fasciculus gracilis in the lower part of the body, fasciculus cuneatus in the upper part of the body above T6. So in the thoracic region, if you're able to distinguish a flea moving on your skin, then that is fasciculus cuneatus. In the lower part, that is fasciculus gracilis. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of the pathway, in that the first order neuron comes from the various regions in the spinal cord, in the dorsal column, and then it synapses within the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus in the medulla oblongata. From the medulla oblongata, we have a second order neuron after synapsing. That second order neuron crosses the midline to the opposite side. So once it crosses to the opposite side, it now forms the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus. This area where they cross over is the area we refer to as sensory decussation. So they cross over from the medial lemniscus and ascend up to the thalamus as second order neuron. And then in the thalamus, they then synapse with a third order neuron, which project to the somatosensory part of the cerebral cortex. So this is the third order neuron. So remember, we have very few synapses. We have only 2 synapses before you reach the cerebral cortex, unlike others which have more synapses. For the other anterolateral column, in the anterolateral column of the spinal cord, for the sensory information, this is transmitted through spinothalamic tract. Spinal, that is the source, spinal cord, and then the thalamus. So spinothalamic tract. These ones, unlike the dorsal column, will have small diameter neurons, alienated. There are very many synapses before it reaches its destination in the somatosensory cortex. Because it has a small diameter, because it's less myelinated, 40 millimeters per second. So it is slow transmission. The lateral spinothalamic tract, which I had shown you before on the lateral column, this carries mainly pain fibers and also the temperature. Pain and then the thermal receptors, that is for temperature. It's just cold or hot. How hot and how cold, that is transmitted through the dorsal. It is hot or cold. Okay, but I cannot distinguish how hot or how cold. I can say this is some fabric, but I cannot distinguish whether it is silk, whether it is cotton, whether it is some synthetic type of fabric. To be able to distinguish that is the dorsal column. The information is transmitted through the dorsal column. Tickle and itch. When somebody tickles you, this is what you feel in the anterior. That information is transmitted through the anterior spinothalamic tract. So this one, we have receptors. From the receptor, this then goes to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. From the dorsal to somatosensory cortex. Dorsal column lateral spinothalamic transmitting pain and temperature, anterior spinothalamic transmitting crude touch, pressure, itch, and tickle. So we have the first order neurons here, which are fibers, for example, pain. These fibers are free nerve endings. They synapse within the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and this is at the area substantia gelatinosa. Substantia gelatinosa in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So that is where the first order neuron ends. Then the second order crosses the midline as commissural fibers. They cross the midline and then continue on either as anterior spinothalamic or lateral spinothalamic tract. Anterior spinothalamic or lateral spinothalamic tract. So they continue on up to the thalamus. They then synapse in the thalamus, and continue on as a third order neuron to the cerebral cortex. So notice here that they cross over in the spinal cord. They cross over in the spinal cord and ascend in the contralateral part of the spinal cord. Unlike in the dorsal horn, which was ascending in the ipsilateral part. This was ascending in the ipsilateral part of the spinal cord, but crosses over in the medulla. So it is contralateral after the medulla. So that is transmission of sensory information in the spinal cord, both spinothalamic and also anterior spinothalamic and lateral spinothalamic tract. So the fibers that we have, the tracts that we have within the spinal cord, I've talked about fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus above T6, spinoreticular. This is carrying also information, but to the reticular formation. This is for touch, temperature, pain. Remember, anterior spinocerebellar, also carrying information to the cerebellum. This is mainly for joints, sensory information from the joints, and also muscle spindle apparatus, so that the cerebellum can be able to regulate movement. Posterior spinothalamic, we talked about. From the spinal cord to the olivary nucleus. This is mainly unconscious proprioception, and this is from the medulla sensory information from the medulla, from the head region, also going for control of movement. Then from the olivary nucleus, we have olivo. From the olivary nucleus, we have, from the olivary nucleus, we also have descending fibers to the spinal cord, olivocerebella. And run in the contralateral part. So the left side at the medulla, the fibers from the left side of the brain will cross over to the right, and the ones from the right will cross over to the left within the medulla oblongata. Rubrospinal, this is from the red nucleus to the spinal cord, again related to movement. Reticulospinal, this one is from the reticular formation in the brain stem, the spinal cord, again, regulation of movement. Vestibulospinal, this is from the ear, from the vestibular apparatus in the middle ear, and this is very important for neck movements, so that when you hear something, you are able to move your head to the area, to be able to move your head to the area where you are actually hearing the sound, the source of the sound. Tectospinal, this one here is from the tectum within the midbrain. We are going to talk about it. This mediates mainly reflex activity associated with vision and also hearing. So those are the descending pathways. Now, I talked about the white matter and the gray matter. I'd like us to look at these four diagrams. When you look at this, we have a lot of white matter and a little gray matter. When you look at this one here, we have a lot of gray matter vis-a-vis the white matter. In the lower parts of the spinal cord, you are relative to white matter. As you ascend in the spinal cord, some information going to the brain. So there'll be an extra ascending neuron. Because of that, the white matter proportionately increase as you move towards the brain. So the gray matter is more on the lower side, the white matter proportionately increases. So this part here is coming from the sacral region. You can see more white matter more gray matter compared to white matter. This butterfly shape is a gray matter. In this one here, notice again, there's a lot of white matter relative to the white matter. But what I wanted to show in this one is this part here. We have a lateral horn. you can see very distinctly a lateral horn. This lateral horn is extending from T1 to L2 segments of the spinal cord. And this represents the sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic nervous system. It's also present in the level of S2, S3, and S4, representing the parasympathetic nervous system. So the lateral horn represents the autonomic nervous system. Notice here a lateral horn, a very distinct lateral horn. But also notice that we have a lot of gray matter. So this one here is the sacral region representing the area of S2, S3, S4. S2, S3, S4. Remember that after synapsing, the nuclei here, axons originating from this now enter and continue as ascending fibers or descending fibers. So this is the sensory part. Substantia gelatinosa is where we have the synapses with the incoming neurons, the central neurons from the spinal ganglia, central fibers from the spinal ganglia. So what happens if the spinal cord is damaged? This we refer to as Brown-Séquard syndrome. And in Brown-Séquard syndrome, I like us to look at these three areas, the three scenarios. Suppose we have a central area here damaged. So we ask ourselves, which cell bodies or which ascending or descending fiber tracts are affected when this is affected? When you are looking at the spinothalamic tract, we said the first order neurons cross the midline to the opposite. They cross the midline to the opposite. So because they cross the midline to the opposite, for me, example, due to dilatation of the central canal in syringomyelia, then these axons will be compressed, and therefore the spinothalamic tract will be affected. Depending on where they are affected, you will then have, therefore, loss of crude touch. We have touch, we have loss of pain, we have temperature, but all of it is crude. Each, for example, is also affected. In this area also, remember we have the descending fibers from the cerebral cortex. We have cell bodies here that are responsible for the regulation of movement. And therefore, we have the upper limb and the lower limb muscle weakness. Sometimes we have the anterior area. So the anterior 2/3, when it is affected, again, look at this. The dorsal column is not affected. So the 3-point description, the pressure, and so on is not affected. However, the lateral corticospinal tract will be affected. anterior corticospinal tract will be affected, and therefore below the area of the lesion. You'll have paralysis, but this paralysis is bilateral. Both sides are affected. Bilateral paralysis. Because of spinothalamic being affected, lateral spinothalamic, anterior spinothalamic being affected, there is low then we have if one side of the spinal cord is affected, again, a tree comprises of the roots, comprises of the trunk, comprises of the stems, and then the leaves at the ends. Let's look at it and look at the nervous system. The roots and the rootlets are like the spinal nerves, collecting information from the rest of the body. That information, which is the spinal cord, we can talk about that as the major roots. And then all that information is then distributed to the various parts of the brain. So the spinal cord is acting like a stem. From the spinal cord, it's connecting to the different parts of the brain. So the brain comprises of three parts. From the spinal cord, you have what you call the medulla oblongata. And medulla oblongata originates from the and then from the medulla oblongata, we have the pons, also considered almost like a bridge. And then from the pons, we have the midbrain. So these three parts constitute the brainstem. You'll also see from this that the cerebellum attaches to the brainstem. You'll also see from this that the cerebral cortex attaches to the brainstem. And the other parts of the diencephalon attach to the brainstem. So that part which was originating from the mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon, except for the medulla, except for the cerebellum, constitutes the brainstem. From the onset, you can therefore see that the brainstem conveys information to the cerebellum, to the cerebral cortex, to the thalamus. So all that information passes through the brainstem. The brainstem also carries information from the cerebral cortex, from the thalamus, from the cerebellum, to the spinal cord. So it's a bridge between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain. That's what we call the brainstem. Generally, the brainstem will consist of a roof. When we talk about a roof, we have this cavity we talked about as the part of the ventricles. So the roof here, we have the cavity here, we have the Sylvian aqueduct, the cerebral aqueduct. We have the fourth ventricle. So anything above that is considered as the roof. Above the ventricle, that's what we call the roof. Then we have middle after the ventricular part, we have the tegmentum. The tegmentum consists of ascending fibers, descending fibers, the reticular formation, and the cranial nerve nuclei. All those are in the tegmentum. And then we have the basal part. The basal part, right at the base, is carrying information from the cerebral cortex, the spinal cord, from the cerebellum, the spinal cord, from the spinal cord, again ascending fibers to the descending fibers mainly to the pons, to the medulla oblongata, from the midbrain to the pons, from the midbrain to the medulla oblongata. All that descending information is carried in the basilar part, what you call the pendangles. We have them as pendangles, we have them as pyramids, and when we have them as the pons, because pons is like a bridge. This is ventral part of the brain, and we see the spinal cord. We have the medulla oblongata. We have the pons, and these are the pendangles. Pendangles consist of fiber tracts. So this basal part here, within the medulla oblongata, we have the pyramid here. We have a median fissure in the spinal cord, which extends as a fissure in the medulla oblongata. But you will notice here that so in this part of the medulla oblongata, this is where fiber tracts cross over to the opposite. The pyramid carries corticospinal tract. So they cross over at the midline here. Because they carry corticospinal tract, so this is a motor decussation, a motor crossing over. So the fibers cross over and continue in the spinal cord as the lateral corticospinal tract, which we had just looked at. So over 95% of the fibers cross over. About 5% of the fibers do not cross over. So they continue on in the spinal cord as the anterior corticospinal tract. So those carry uncrossed fibers. So this is where we call pyramidal decussation. In the medulla, we also have here the pons. Within the medulla, sorry, we have here the olive. This swelling here is the olive and contains cell bodies for the olivary nucleus. Cell bodies for the olivary nucleus. And nucleus in the brain is aggregates of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So this is the olivary nucleus. So we have here a depression, a sulcus, and then another depression on the lateral side of the olive. Also notice here the cranial nerves, spinal accessory nerve. Notice the emergence of other cranial nerves here between the boundary of the pons and the medulla, because the cranial nerves all originate from the brainstem. They have their cell bodies in the brainstem, except of course a few, which we'll be talking about later on. So the medulla comprises ventrally of a median sulcus, and in this median sulcus, we have the area of decussation, pyramidal. That's what you see ventrally. And then at the ventrolateral part of the pyramid, we have a sulcus and then the olive, which you have said comprises of olivary nucleus. At the ventrolateral part of the sulcus, we have cranial nerves emerging, the hypoglossal nerve, accessory nerve, the vagus nerve, and glossopharyngeal nerve. Those emerge at the ventrolateral part sulcus. On the dorsal part of the medulla, medulla has two parts. We have the dorsal sulcus, which is, and then eventually when the medulla is in the open part in the fourth ventricle, then we have also a sulcus. And that sulcus divides the fasciculus gracilis from fasciculus cuneatus. That's a dorsolateral sulcus and a median sulcus. Now the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus at the mid part of the medulla. Then we have the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. And remember, the nucleus is aggregates of cell bodies. At the border of the pons, we have the 8th cranial nerve, the 7th cranial nerve, and the 6th cranial nerve. What is the function of the medulla oblongata? Because it contains the cranial nerve nuclei, hypoglossal nerve, the vagus nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve. Remember, the vagus nerve is very important, supplies most of the viscera in the neck region, viscera in the thorax, and viscera in the abdomen, except in the pelvic region. Glossopharyngeal nerve supplies the viscera in the neck region. Accessory nerve supplies muscle of the neck. Hypoglossal nerve supplies muscles of the tongue. And then we also have, remember I talked about the tegmentum, we have the reticular formation. So the main functions of the medulla is mainly autonomic functions, regulates breathing, respiration, coughing, circulation, heart rate, swallowing, the gag reflex, mainly from glossopharyngeal and vagus. And then they, of course, conducting pathways. So most of these functions you will notice are because of the cranial nerve nuclei and also the reticular formation centers. So the breathing center, the circulatory center are all in the medulla oblongata. So if there's damage to the medulla oblongata, you have your respiratory function arrest. You also have your cardiovascular functions are arrested. So let's look at the spinal cord and medulla. We have talked about the spinal cord. We have talked about where we have ascending and descending fibers. The caudal part of the medulla oblongata is like that of the spinal cord. So we still have those fibers ascending and descending with a central canal. Then at the area of decussation, as you move more cranially, we have the area of decussation, which I talked about. The lateral corticospinal tract from the medulla. Remember, lateral corticospinal tract is also in the medulla. Fibers decussate, they cross over to the opposite to form the opposite part of the pyramid that we now call the corticospinal tract, containing corticospinal tracts. So this is the area we refer to as the area of motor decussation. Otherwise, the rest of the medulla is like that of the spinal cord with the central canal. And then we have the white matter, the gray matter, sorry, just like what we had in the spinal cord, and then the white matter areas. As you move more cranially, this is the area of motor decussation, forming the pyramid. So the fibers here are from the opposite, from the lateral corticospinal tract, are from the opposite. So these fibers on this side will form the contralateral part of the lateral corticospinal tract in the spinal cord. Contralateral, because it's crossing over. And then we have the spinal from there. Spinocerebellar. Remember, we had spinocerebellar tract. Also, column still extends at the area of decussation. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, which we had talked about. After the area, as we move more cranially, the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Nucleus and nucleus cuneatus. The fibers from the nucleus gracilis order neurons. Now remember, from the dorsal column, the second order neurons now cross the midline to the opposite to form the medial lemniscus. At the area of the crossing, because this is sensory information, we therefore refer to this as sensory decussation. Sensory decussation. So the information from the dorsal column, at nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus at the medulla oblongata, then the cell bodies of those neurons then cross over at the midline, forming sensory decussation to form medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus. So these medial lemniscus fibers continue on now in the medulla oblongata as medial lemniscus. In the area of the pons, the fibers again form a sort of 90-degree rotation in the pons, but continue as medial lemniscus. The others are cell bodies for the nuclei, depending on where you are. Most caudally, you have the hypoglossal nerve, very close to the midline. The hypoglossal nerve, cell bodies for the hypoglossal nerve. We also have cell bodies for other neurons originating from the medulla oblongata. So this is what you see at the area of sensory decussation. So this fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. Remember, we have both cell bodies and the fibers as you move more cranially. And then this is at the mid-olivary. At the mid-olivary, remember there was a pyramid and there was an olive. At the mid-olivary, we have the olivary nucleus. The type of nuclear aggregates that constitutes the olive, the principal olivary nucleus. Principal olivary nucleus. And then, just like what we saw in the spinal cord, those fibers from the cerebellum, spinal cord, still going to the cerebellum, spinocerebellar, are still continuing to the cerebellum because the cerebellum connects at the pons. And then from the nuclear gracilis and cuneatus, we have the internal arcuate fibers, which are the second order neurons from the dorsal column, forming now the medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus. The other ascending and descending fiber tracts will also be there in the medulla oblongata. So that is the medulla oblongata. We said the most basal part comprises of the descending fibers, and those descending fibers are the pyramid containing corticospinal tract. The tegmentum comprises of cell bodies of cranial nerves. It also comprises of the reticular formation nuclei, comprises of the ascending tracts. Spinocerebellar is an ascending tract. Also comprises of cell bodies of the cranial nerve nuclei. For the pons is a bridge. The pons originate from the metencephalon. The cerebellum also originates from the rhombic lip of the metencephalon. So pons acts as a bridge between the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and the midbrain. So the fiber tracts that connect this form cerebellar pendangles, cerebral pendangles, the midbrain, cerebellar pendangles to the cerebellum. I said cerebral pendangle to the midbrain, cerebellar pendangles to the cerebellum. We have the middle cerebellar pendangle, is what you see here. The anterior cerebellar pendangle, and these contain axons, bundles of axons. Pons at the tegmentum also contain cranial nerve nuclei. Cranial nerve nuclei for the trigeminal nerve, the abducens nerve to the eye, facial nerve, the muscles of facial expression and the other parts, the vestibulocochlear nerve to the ear, middle inner ear. So all these cranial nerve nuclei are within the tegmentum. So the main functions of pons is mainly arousal because of the reticular formation nuclei, cardiac reflexes, again, at the area of reticular formation nuclei, sleep and wake cycles, micturition, and also breathing. So you can notice that the brainstem, because of the reticular formation, is very important in both cardiac and respiratory functions. We'll talk about reticular formation later. And also, the functions of pons could be related to the cranial nerve functions. Trigeminal nerve is sensory to the face. Abducens nerve supplies the lateral rectus muscles of the eye. The facial nerve supplies all muscles of facial expression, also supplies the lacrimal glands and the salivary glands. Vestibulocochlear nerve is from the ear, mainly very important in balance for vestibular and also hearing. So you can relate this information and also know that should there be any damage in the pons, in the respective cranial nerve nuclei, organization. The most caudal part of the pons, remember, we have the cerebellum originating from the roof, from the rhombic lip of the mesenteric. So in the case of the pons, the roof is mainly made up of cerebellum. And then we have the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle. And overriding the fourth ventricle, we have the cerebellum, the superior and inferior velum, the cerebellum, forming the roof. And when you notice here, this enlargement and this depression here is equivalent to sulcus limitans of our rhombencephalon. So this part will be structures originating from the basal plate, and anywhere lateral to this part here will be from the ulnar plate. So any cranial nerve nuclei here will be from the basal plate, any cranial nerve lateral to the sulcus limitans here will be from the ulnar plate. Superior medullary velum is, we'll be able to see it later on. So this is our tegmentum. And the tegmentum here consists of cranial nerve nuclei. It consists of ascending fibers, like our medial lemniscus. Later on, and then trigeminal lemniscus. So that is what we have in the tegmentum. As you move towards this, the basal part of the pons. And the basal part of the pons, like we had said, comprise of descending fibers. And these descending fibers, we have descending fibers, but we also have crossed fibers. The descending fibers are the corticopontine, corticospinal, which continue on in the medulla as the pyramid, and the cassette at the medulla. Corticobulbar, which is from the cerebral cortex, and synapse with the cranial nerve nuclei that let me repeat. Corticopontine terminate in the pons and synapse with the pontine nuclei. Decussate at the pyramidal decussation and continue as lateral corticospinal tract in the spinal cord. Nerve nuclei in the bones, and this corticobulbar synapse to the cranial nerve nuclei important for both eye movements and neck movements, and this also extends to the medulla. The corticobulbar tracts extend to the medulla. Then we have these transverse fibers or horizontal fibers. These transverse fibers connect the various pontine nuclei to the cerebellum. So they form the pontocerebellar tract. Pontocerebellar tract. So that is what we have in the basal part of the pons. So the horizontal fibers are part of the fibers that form the pendangle, the middle cerebellar pendangle carrying pontocerebellar tracts. The medial longitudinal fasciculars here, these ones are fiber tracts connecting the various cranial nerve nuclei associated with eye movements. Remember, trigeminal nerve? Trigeminal nerve has several components. It has a sensory component and a motor component. Of the trigeminal nerve, notice the location of the sensory component. It's more medial, close to the midline. So this would be from the ala plate. This will be from the basal plate. So that is our bones. Let's now look. This is the brain, just like what we have seen. So this one here is our medulla. We have talked about medulla. These are pons. I'd like you to note in these pons some white areas, pale staining areas, and dark staining gray areas. These dark staining gray areas are cranial nerve nuclei, are pontine nuclei. These pale staining areas, these ones are now the fiber tracts. The fiber tracts. So we say the pons is a bridge between the medulla, the midbrain, the medulla, cerebellum, and the midbrain. So what do we have then in the midbrain? The midbrain develops from mesencephalon. Mesencephalon. The midbrain develops from mesencephalon. And remember, mesencephalon does not divide. doesn't divide, so it continues on as primary brain vesicle and also as secondary brain vesicle. As primary brain vesicle and also as secondary brain vesicle. The slides you are going to look at, you will see this slide, and in this slide, you will notice medial longitudinal fasciculars, the pyramid, the pyramid below there is the pyramid. You will also notice origin of the cranial nerve nuclei, which happens to be the oculomotor nerve, sorry, not oculomotor, but the hypoglossal of crisscrossing. So this is what we call reticular formation. We'll be able to go look at that later on. And also notice the olivary nucleus at the mid-olivary region. This is at the midline of the medulla oblongata. And in this part of the medulla oblongata, notice the fibers crossing over here. So this way we have this, the tegmentum, and this way we have our reticular formation. We'll address reticular formation later on. But I just wanted to show that once the cell bodies, from the cell bodies, we have axons. Those axons collect as bundles that now form a cranial nerve. So for the bones, we talked about their function, including the breathing, cardiac functions, and respiratory functions. And respiratory functions. We would also have micturition. Part of micturition is at the bones, but most of it so we have pontine micturition reflex center. This is mainly to detect the filling of the urinary bladder, detect the tension in the urinary bladder. Once there is filling to a threshold, then the information is sent now through the descending fiber tracts to the level of S2, S4. S2, S4, which is the parasympathetic part. And then from this parasympathetic part, that now causes the contraction of the detrusor muscle of the urinary bladder. That is the micturition reflex activity. So the pontine micturition reflex center is within the pons, and that is what you need to note. From this pontine micturition reflex center, this also controls the distal part of the colon. And that's why in most cases, as you urinate, you also defecate at the same time, urinating and defecating. However, you can control defecation because of different regulatory mechanisms. But this is normally what happens in the case of the micturition reflex activity controlled by pontine micturition reflex center. Now, part of the micturition reflex center is controlled by the periaqueductal gray matter, and this periaqueductal gray matter is a center within the midbrain. So I'd like us now to look at, well, I've shown you this picture about the pons to show the pendangle. I've also shown you this one, but at high magnification, you can now see that we have these white areas. These are actually fiber tracts. You can see they're extending from the midbrain. These are the corticospinal tract. We have corticopontine tract, corticobulbar tract, and within here we have the pontine nuclei. And in this position, this way we have the nuclei for the cranial nerves and the fourth ventricle here. Nuclei, and you can see them here. Cranial nerve nuclei for the abducens, for the facial nerve, and then the other tracts that are ascending, the medial lemniscus, which we had said at pons is at right angles. We have the trigeminal lemniscus from the trigeminal nerve. We have spinal lemniscus, very important, from the mainly head region. And then as we move further, we have the lateral lemniscus. The nucleus of Trocta solitarius, these are nuclei for some cranial nerves, which we'll talk about. Superior salivatory nucleus, these are again nucleus for both glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve, which is extending. Abducens nucleus, nerve from abducens nucleus. I'd like you to note that this nucleus for the facial nerve winds around the abducens nucleus. Because it winds around the abducens nucleus, there is an elevation here. That elevation we refer to as the facial colliculus. Facial colliculus. And then dorsal cochlear nucleus, remember vestibular cochlea, also originating from the but notice also that it's originating far away from the midline, because the motor is the one that originates close to the midline. Sensory originate far. At the close part of the pons, again, we have those tracts that are continuing on as ascending tracts, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, lateral lemniscus. Lateral lemniscus is mainly from the vestibular cochlea, spinal lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus from the trigeminal nerve, carrying information from the trigeminal nerve, and then the medial lemniscus, again from our dorsal column. So notice the arrangement in this position. For the midbrain I've said originate from the mesencephalon, And the midbrain mesencephalon remains as a primary vesicle, but also as a secondary vesicle. At the midbrain, this pierces our dura mater, what pierces tendorium cerebelli, and at the area where it pierces tendorium cerebelli, we have what is called tendorial hiatus. So on the dorsal part of the midbrain, is also at the interpendangular fossa. And at the place of the interpendangular fossa, we have the oculomotor nerve originating. Now we have dorsal part of the midbrain, we have what is called corpora quadrigemina. Corpora quadrigemina, these are four bodies. Corpora means bodies, quad means four, quadrigemina. This represents paired superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. Superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. The superior colliculus, a colliculi is a hump-like structure. So superior colliculus is a hump-like structure, more superiorly, and is very important. It mediates reflex activity of the neck associated with vision. You see something, you turn your head, be able to see a moving vehicle or a moving person. So that is mediated through superior colliculi. And then at the inferior colliculi, this mediates reflex activity associated with hearing. You hear something, you turn your head towards the source of the sound. So this turns the neck muscles towards the source of the sound. And this depression here is what we call a cruciform sulcus. Cruciform sulcus, because it's formed something like a cross, cruciform sulcus, separating the colliculi. At the height of the peak of the cruciform colliculus, that is the location of our pineal body. Pineal body. Piercing through the midbrain, we have the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct. So above the cerebral aqueduct, that is what we call the tectum, comprising of corpora quadrigemina, superior and inferior colliculi. Then around the cerebral aqueduct, we have the periaqueductal gray matter. Periaqueductal gray matter, which I've talked about before as part of the regulation of micturition reflex activity. The midbrain is also contain cranial nerve nuclei. Cranial nerve nuclei for the oculomotor nerve, to the eye muscles, and the trochlear nerve. Oculomotor nerve to the eye muscles and the trochlear nerve. So in general, you can say then that it's very important for eye muscles movement of eye muscles because of the cranial nerve nuclei. It also contains the reticular nuclei. Because it contains reticular nuclei are very important in arousal, very important also in part of the movement. Remember, there was something called reticulospinal. From the reticular formation to the spinal cord, again, control eye movement and control body movements. The midbrain contains periaqueductal gray matter, and periaqueductal gray matter is very important in modulating important functions of the organisms. These include autonomic activity. Remember, autonomic is like breathing, your heart rate, movements of your digestive tract, and so on. All that is autonomic. Papillary reflex, that's autonomic. We're going to look at that. Behavior, again, activity through connection to the limbic system. Pain, we talked about pain. Okay, we talked about pain, spinothalamic tract. The lateral spinothalamic tract is very important in pain. That's going to the thalamus. But we also have modulation of that pain. We have descending fibers, descending information that modulate that pain, so that sometimes the intensity of pain depends on the individual's perception. You can modulate the pain. So modulation of pain is through periaqueductal gray matter. Urinary bladder, again, micturition reflex center, voiding of urine. So this is just to show the midbrain. This is the midbrain here. And in this midbrain, you can see our cerebral aqueduct, the narrowest part of our ventricular system. And then the roof contain superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. And I said superior colliculi is a hump-like structure. It's like a hump. And then this part here is the tectum, a tegmentum. So this is the tectum, this is the tegmentum of the midbrain, and this is the basal part of the midbrain. So let's now look at the structure of this. Again, in this section here, a transverse section, you can see the colliculi, you can see the cerebral aqueduct, periaqueductal gray matter, and then some very important nuclei associated with the midbrain include the red nucleus, and the red nucleus is a source for the rubrospinal tract. And that is very important in, again, control of movement. Then we have this part here, which contains some pigmented neurons. We call it substantia nigra. Substantia nigra. It contains pigmented neurons which contain melanin. And these ones here are, because they contain melanin, these ones also are part of the extrapyramidal motor pathway. We're talking about extrapyramidal motor pathway. So these ones here are the important cranial nerve nuclei that we have, the nuclei that we have within the midbrain. Apart from that, we have the nuclei for the oculomotor and also nuclei for the trochlea. The trochlea is the only cranial nerve that emerges from the posterior part. It emerges from the posterior part. The trochlea. That's why it's called trochlea. Apart from that, the basal part of the, remember this is the tectum, all of this is the tegmentum, and the basal part of the midbrain contains what you refer to as the crus cerebri. Crus cerebri. And the crus cerebri, just like what we saw in the basal part in the other one, contain mainly some descending pathways from the cerebral cortex, passing through the pons to the spinal cord. So these descending pathways, remember the ones which were in the medulla, in the pons, we had corticopontine, so they are also here. We have corticobulbar, they are also here. Corticopontine, corticobulbar are also here. Corticospinal are also here within this crus cerebri. We also have at these positions here, we have parietopontine coming from the parietal of the pontine, occipitopontine coming from the occipital of the pontine. All those are within here. The most lateral are the parietopontine and also occipitopontine fibers are in this part here. So all these are descending fiber tracts that are going either to the medulla of the pons or the spinal cord. And then apart from this, we also had, remember, our lateral lemniscus, spinal lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus. All these ones are also in the bones, in the midbrain, sorry. Apart from that, of course, we have reticular formation, which is very important. So this is just like the arrangement of what we have.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
We have another class at 4 p.m. So I was requesting if you that.
Fine, I'm just winding up. Let me just wind up. So this is what we have as a midbrain, frontopontine, corticopontine, corticobulbar, parietopontine, temporopontine, and then also occipitopontine. So these are fiber tracts within the basal part. From here, we'll look at the cranial nerves in the next session as originating from the brainstem, the cranial nerves of the 12 cranial nerves, and look at their position. And then after that, we'll go to the other parts of the central nervous system. So remember, the brainstem is very important as cranial nerve nuclear source. We also have ascending and descending fiber tracts. The descending fiber tracts are within the basal part. In the tegmentum, we have cranial nerve nuclei and other nuclei. So we'll stop here. I'll invite any questions. For syringomyelia, somebody has put a question there about syringomyelia. When we have for example, during development, sometimes you can have an abnormality where there can be blockage of CSF. Because of that blockage of CSF, the central canal of the spinal cord gets filled with the fluid that pushes outwards. It's like a syringe. It pushes outwards, it dilates. As a result of dilatation, it's going to press on the nerves very close, axons very close to the central canal. Some of those axons close to the central canal happens to be the spinothalamic tract, which are crossing from one side to the opposite. Because of those, spinothalamic tracts will be affected, and therefore you will have loss of sensation. That is basically what we have. Thank you very much for listening. You can put your questions later on. We'll be able to answer them in the next session. I'd like us to start the next session on time. And we will start with the cranial nerve nuclei, which will be more or less a revision. Class rep, let me know when you can have our next session.